people are constantly raising the bar.
Sacrifices need to be made.
What would you guys say are your biggest weaknesses?
You or your enemy right now?
Is success a lie?
Just a fucking podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hustle Show. This week we're sort of doing a joint conversation between Kedric Kwan from the Strength Guys and Joe Stanek from the Strength Athlete. So these are two fantastic powerlifting coaches, and I think this is going to be quite an interesting conversation because in terms of powerlifting, I know basically nothing. So that's the sort of the premise of this. So we're going to sort of go over a lot of things in terms of basics of powerlifting, how to basically get strong as fuck, and basically how you program that. So we'll start off with you, Joe. So Joe, where have you come from? What do you do? What is your general backstory?
Sure. So, like you said, my name is Joe Stanek. I have been in and around the powerlifting world since I was about 13. Did my first meet when I was about 13 years old. Kind of bounced around a few different sports, and then ultimately came back to it around my college years. I have a background in exercise science. I have my BS in that from Syracuse University. Most importantly, however, I have been raised up, you could say, by the gentleman from the Strength Athlete. So I learned pretty much everything I know from them. I've been a full-time coach with them for a little over 3 years now, which is crazy. It seems like it's been forever. I'm also lucky enough to be an assistant team coach for the USA Powerlifting National Team. I've gotten to do that 2 years in a row now. And in general, just a lover of powerlifting and love to work with individuals such as yourself who know nothing about powerlifting. So I think it should be a fun conversation.
Yeah, should be good. So, and Kedric, he was recently on, I think it was episode 113, I think, maybe 14. But we talked about weight cutting previously. So, Kedric, for those who don't know you, who didn't listen to those episodes, do you want to give them a little bit of backstory about yourself? Where do you come from? What do you do?
Right, so as mentioned, my name is Kedric, and right now I'm based out of New Zealand. Doing my PhD looking at weight cutting strategies for powerlifters. So in specific, rapid weight cutting within the last 5 to 7 days for powerlifting. And how I started off, I think I did my first meet when I was like 19, and then I'm 18 and 19, but then I dabbled in and out of powerlifting here and there. But the journey really started when I decided to pursue exercise science for my formal education. Ended up with a master's degree in sports and exercise nutrition. And while I was writing up my thesis, did an internship with the Strength Guys, learned a ton from them. And fun fact, Joe also started it off as an intern for the Strength Athlete. So we call ourselves like the intern crew once in a while. Remind us of our humble beginnings, which is always important to know where you come from. So, started off with the Strength Guys, learned a ton from all of them. We have a good crew, Jason Tremblay, Ben Ashgrove, Alfred, we are all like tight and fun, and I would say love powerlifting a lot. And recently came back from Sweden, where I was one of the coaches for Team New Zealand, and had a fun time at Worlds at Sweden collecting survey data. And it's also where Joe and I have met up for the second time.
The bromance began last year.
The romance started last year in Calgary at Worlds, and this year in Sweden. Not sure what it will look like next year, but we'll see. So yeah, that's basically it. Just love getting strong, love helping people get strong, and talking about powerlifting, and just helping people get strong in general.
Boom, fantastic. So, I think a good place to start might be, if any, is there, from your guys' perspective, do you think, is there any prerequisites you think someone should sort of take into account before they get into powerlifting or take powerlifting seriously or compete in a meet or whatever the sort of area is? Is there certain things that someone should get down before they try and really go in on the serious stuff? Is there anything they should try and sort of really focus on before they sort of try and go into powerlifting? Anything that's sort of a safe idea, something they should sort of get down before they can actually understand anything more advanced, sort of the basics that people might commonly skip or might like to skip?
Kedric, do you want to go first or should I?
You can go first.
All right, cool. So I think my answer is going to be a little philosophical here. I think the first thing is understanding that powerlifting is first and foremost a journey that you take with yourself. A lot of people get into the sport because they want to feel strong. They want to see progression in their lifting. Oftentimes, I think especially in this day and age, in the age of social media, people get caught up in the idea of comparing themselves to everybody else. And I think before you even start, you should understand that the sport is about you and your personal progression first and foremost. I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but a lot of people that get into powerlifting are never going to be world champions. So if you're going to enjoy this sport and get the most out of it, you should understand that it's all about personal progression first and foremost. Competition is fun, but if you can't beat yourself, then there's no point in getting into it. Okay, now that I'm done raining on that parade. From a lifting standpoint, though, you should have a love of lifting. You don't necessarily need to have a huge background in lifting. If powerlifting just seems cool to you and you just want to pick up a barbell, you could get started from almost nothing. I think it would probably be a good idea to have a background in lifting because generally if you've been training for a while, you've almost certainly done a squat, bench press, and deadlift, which are the three main lifts of powerlifting. So being able to at least have a remote idea how to execute those lifts would be helpful, but is not 100% necessary. I also think you should be able to move through the full range of motion of those lifts without any pain or any sort of mobility deficit. If you have those, then it's probably a good idea to address those first before you dive headlong into training.
I think that's very, very sensible remarks. Kedric, not Kendrick. Anything to add?
Now I wish I've gone first because Joe literally stole the philosophical advice or word from me because I was about to say the same thing. But I think at the end of the day, asking yourself why you're in the sport is very important, right? Just to continue with the philosophical tangent. I was having this conversation with Matt Gary, and he was talking about we talk about people in the sport nowadays. They just wanted to do powerlifting for this year. I want to get strong now. I want to do powerlifting next year, right? But what about 5 years from now? What about 6 years from now? How does that come into play? People, especially with sort of the younger generation, and as Joe mentioned prior, the age of social media, it's easy to compare yourself with others. It's easy to say, oh no, other people are getting stronger. My competitors are getting stronger. I should be making gains faster as well. And going through that process, and comparing yourself to others isn't really the right mindset to start powerlifting with. You don't want to just be doing powerlifting this year or next year. Think about powerlifting as something. If it's a sport that you really enjoy and love, think about powerlifting as something you would like to do for 5 years or maybe even 10 years down the road. So I think having that mindset, having that perspective that powerlifting, like any sport, is a journey and it's a process, is very important to start with, which brings me to my second point. And I think being someone who sort of, like I mentioned, dabble in and out powerlifting, I mean, people might hate on it, but powerlifting is like a sport, a strength sport, which means if you decide to pursue this as a sport, there would be other things you have to sacrifice, in the sense that I used to play a lot of football, or in America they call it soccer, and I thought I could do both, right? But with everything that you only have 24 hours in the day, and there's an opportunity cost, and I won't even go into the competing effects of doing a lot of running and training for football, their endurance, and how that affects strength development. But I think of it as an opportunity cost, and if it's something that you love, you can't expect to be good at it, and then while being good at everything else that you used to do prior. So you have to evaluate what do you really want to get out from powerlifting, set realistic expectations before entering the sport. And in terms of sort of lifting or technical abilities wise, I think Joe covered it quite well. The basic thing would be the ability to execute the lift according to through the competition range of motion. So squatting to depth, benching with a pause, and a full range of deadlift without any pain or limitations. That would be pretty important. So if you lack that, perhaps try to address that before jumping head first. And I would say, as long as you've done some form of the bench press, back squat, or deadlift, most people should be pretty much set. And like I say, it's a low barrier. There's low barriers to enter the sport, so I don't think there is much in terms of technical proficiency that you need to have before entering, because all those can be developed over time.
Yeah, I think that definitely sounds quite true, because I think, like, especially the thing about sort of being quite specific around powerlifting, because I used to be a distance runner, and it's like I tried to be I didn't call it a bodybuilder, but I was like trying to be a bodybuilder at the time, and trying to run half marathons, and it just takes a fucking toll. Like, it's just like way too brutal, and you kind of, I think you get to a point where you can need to commit to the one sport and go all in on that and sort of have a bit more specificity. Obviously, you can be a bit well-rounded, but still, I think definitely going all in on the one thing is definitely a good idea. So, in terms of basic powerlifting programming, what are the main... When we start off lifting weights, right, we sort of think, okay, this is the rep range for hypertrophy, this is the rep range for that, this and this. And I think it's very... at the start, we view it as very black and white. Is there a black and white sort of structure or thing you should sort of stay in? For instance, speaking around things like rep ranges, what sort of RPEs and RIR should we generally be working in terms of training to be a powerlifter? And then we'll move on to things like exercise selection, how much should you vary from the 3 lifts, etc., etc. So what do you guys generally think in terms of that? What sort of specifics do you need in a powerlifting program?
Wow. Okay. So starting off, I think the most basic thing, obviously, is you have to do the thing. You have to squat, bench, and deadlift, because that is part of competition. You have to actually execute it. Generally, with any specific powerlifting program, it's going to be periodized. So for those that are unfamiliar with the term periodization, that's just the organization of training. It's organized into different weeks, different blocks, different days. So you're going to have a periodized training cycle, which you follow up to a peak. The peak should be lined up with your meet or your mock meet or your rep test, some kind of test, usually at the end. And those training cycles are usually broken up, at least for most people, into training blocks. Each block usually has a specific goal. For most powerlifting programs, you're going to see 3 different types. A volume block, where we're typically doing higher repetition training, maybe a little bit less specific during that block. There's a strength or an intensification block, which usually is where we up the intensity, maybe start to bring the specificity up a little bit, and are generally taking some of our heaviest lifts. We might also end up overreaching a little bit during those blocks. And then the peaking block, as you might guess, is to peak you. So the idea is to dissipate some of that fatigue while keeping your fitness, your ability to lift the heavy weights, as high as possible into competition.
Right. Anything to add on to that, Kedric?
Yeah, I think Joe did a great job of explaining it. I think looking at the structure of powerlifting, we understand that powerlifting is a sport, and usually when you sign up for a meet, you have a rough idea of how many weeks out. We like to use the term weeks out, meaning how far you are away from competition, and then we sort of like plan towards that. So the further you are out from competition, in a way, you can get away with less specific work. As Joe mentioned just now, you have to do the lift. Let's say if you squat low bar in competition, you have to low bar squat. You have to have some form of practice. Bench press, you have to bench to your chest with a pause, and you have to do your competition deadlift, whether it's the sumo or conventional deadlift. You have to have some form of practice closer towards competition. But the further away you are, you can have some variation. which you said we will have a segue into exercise selection. You can have some variation, and you can have like maybe for the purpose of like working different joint angles or just taking a break from competition movement, especially if you just came out from a meet, breaking through monotony of doing the same thing over and over again. You can get away with that further away from competition. And as Joe mentioned, there's sort of like different blocks, right? Typical going back into the literature or like periodization of like block training. The different blocks sort of like targets different like qualities, like accumulation block with like lower intensity with more repetitions, more sets, higher volume in general, just to accumulate more workload, potentially develop some muscle. Sort of intensification block, as Joe mentioned, would sort of like think of it as like a strength block, where you transition to slightly higher loads, keeping volume moderate, and then to peak is basically just to prepare you to express your qualities, or like for powerlifting to express strength, your maximal strength in the competition lifts. So those are the general structure of, I would say, the program, and how it leads up to competition, and the amount of time you spend in certain blocks developing certain qualities can vary from individual to individual, but usually they range between 4 to 6 weeks, and the peak usually lasts maybe like 4 weeks, depending on individual variances. So
right.
Yep.
And then in terms when you because I guess in bodybuilding we call am I correct? We call a block like a mesocycle. Is that similar sort of thing?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then in terms of, we'll get some hard numbers down. In terms of the different blocks, when are we generally training? Because I know we commonly, when I say we, I mean like bodybuilders, commonly use like RPE or RIR. Those are sort of the really common ones. I know I seem to notice powerlifters tend to more use RPE, but also something like percentage of 1RM or stuff like that. When using those kind of metrics, how and when would you go into sort of the really high RPEs or the really high percentages to 1RM, and would that be in every block or at some point during a block? So how would that be placed, and how often are we working sub-maximally sort of in the lower RPEs and stuff like that?
So I'll give you the general gist of what let's say we're talking about, the most basic building blocks here of a program. Because the big thing to note, I think, with everything that we're probably going to say here is that we're talking about the general avatar of a powerlifter here. There's definitely going to be differences if you're male, female, if you've been training for longer, that kind of deal. So we should preface that before we go forward. But in general, RPE is going to climb as the training cycle goes on. This is obviously due to the fact that our heaviest lift that we're going to take, our one max that we'll hopefully be able to execute in competition, is happening at the end of the training cycle. So that's just going to linearly increase over the course of it. This also matches up with the goals of the blocks that we have. Generally speaking, if we're doing a lot of training volume, a lot more sets and reps, in order to keep that balance so that we don't become overreached, the RPE of all of the sets that we're doing, or the intensity if we're using percentage-based, naturally just has to be lower. Typically, since sets and reps usually decreases over the course of the training blocks, intensity rises at a oh my goodness, with a, I can't think of the relationship there. Negative relationship? I don't quite remember my statistics. It's been years since I've been in school for statistics, but generally intensity rises as volume decreases over the course of a training cycle. So therefore, RPEs are usually, or percentages, are usually going to be lower at the start and higher at the end.
Anything to sort of comment or add on?
Yep. So looking at, I mean the RIR, which we should tell people, like, RIR means repetitions in reserve. So in case for those that don't understand what RIR means, and RPE is rate of perceived exertion. So the RPE scale was originally developed, I think, if I'm mistaken, by Borg for endurance runners, so it's a scale up to 20. But then, like through the work of like Mike T, or Mike Tuchel, Eric Helms, and Mike Zordos, they sort of like modified and adapt the RPE scale for strength athletes, powerlifters, and bodybuilders. And with the recent like development of the RIR scale, so it's think of RPE and RIR as something
the same but different.
Yeah, the same but different in terms of how you will rate it. So RIR means repetitions in reserve, or for bodybuilders, the term that bodybuilders would use is how many reps do you have left in the tank, right? Obviously, we can't use HMRITT, right? Because that's too long for anything. We can't use the abbreviations for how many reps left in the tank. And so generally, if you say we are doing something that's 1 RIR, it's literally 9 RPE. So a 10, it's a scale from usually 6 to 10, because anything less than 6 is a warm-up. So for RPE of 10 means maximal effort, which means your RIR is 0, meaning that there's no more repetitions in reserve, no more reps in the tank left. So as just something to clarify, so as Joe mentioned, RIR or RPE would generally go up. So, and because the competition lift is a 1 rep max, your RPE should be a 10 or around a 10, or if you fail, it's probably like RPE 1000. And your RIR would be 0. So generally, the scale will move towards a RPE 10 or RIR 0 approaching competition as you practice more singles with heavier load to sort of like have more specific training stimulus. So exactly what Joe mentioned, and I think if you would like to say how we use it on a general sense, for myself, Joe could probably add on later. For beginners, especially with a complete novice, I don't use any form of like RPE or generally RPE or RR, they're considered as subjective methods of autoregulation, right? I don't use any subjective methods of autoregulation because the research has shown that a beginner has not, their sense of judgment isn't as accurate just because they haven't spent enough time under the barbell, so they don't really know what it feels like to push through, or they might be undershooting or overshooting, and just judgment for their subjective judgment isn't as accurate. So generally, I would say I would program percentage/load for a novice, and because someone is quite new to training, they can adapt quite quickly as well, right? From a week to week, they could potentially, even from session to session, we remember those times when we first went into the gym and we could just put on 5 kilos from session to session, and that's generally what I do. And I use sort of like more of I use the RPE at that point as a teaching tool. I said, right, just let me know what you feel what do you think the RPE of this set is, and then if we have video feedback, I'll look at the videos and then I'll correlate and see, oh, okay, this guy thinks that this is RPE 8. Yes, no, maybe, right? Then we go on from there. We use it as a teaching tool to get someone familiarized with the system so that we can potentially use it in the future. And I use it more of sort of like an information gathering process where if someone has been constantly hitting like RPE 10 all the time, I could say, hey, man, like fatigue. I mean, you're hitting really high RPEs in a block where you shouldn't be. Like, is there anything going on with outside of training? How has your sleep been? Are you in a period of exams? Things like that. So besides the fact that subjective measures for autoregulation can be used to prescribe load or volume, I kind of use it as like a feedback tool to tell me like the state of an athlete and how they are performing during training and what are the other factors outside that can potentially affect someone. So, yeah.
Anything to add on there, Joe?
No, I think Kedric covered that pretty well. Like, generally speaking, I'm not really going to give a pure beginner any form of auto-regulation that is completely subjective. I do love using the RP of the last set that a beginner is doing as a teaching tool, just like Kedric. and I'll typically use that as a way to sort of teach them, what their body is doing. It's always good to be able to think critically about the lifts that you're doing, and the better that they understand that, the more productive our training is going to be. Especially for those that are a little bit more advanced, I think that tracking the last set RPE of pretty much every single thing that you're doing is a really great way to see how you're handling your training volume as well. So some lifters, even if they're a little bit more experienced, still prefer percentage-based training. Even if that was the case, I would still have them tracking their RPEs just so that I can see how they're handling their training volume.
Right. Also gives the coach a pretty good sort of subjective measure to gauge things by.
Yes.
One thing that I think in the bodybuilding world recently has been almost a debate, but I kind of think it shouldn't even be. I don't think it's even debatable, but I think it's subjective for some people in bodybuilding, maybe. But I think it's almost case closed. Would you guys like to? And what I'm talking about is there's like a reasonably big debate around RIR versus failure training in like the British bodybuilding community. They're sort of debating why and which and in what situation and all that. Personally, I more believe RIR for most people is a good idea. In terms of powerlifting, why or what's the general reasoning behind, for the most part, working below an RPE 10 for the most part? Because I know a lot of people, when you first get this is like basic fitness stuff. When you first get into fitness, you think, okay, the harder I work, the better, blah, blah, blah. And then having no sort of thought process behind, okay, what is this going to do for me in a week's time, 2 weeks' time, etc. Would you guys like to sort of cover that? Why are we mainly working sub-maximally?
So I think just from if we're talking basic fitness stuff standpoint, I think most people understand that a compound lift is generally very taxing because it involves multiple muscle groups, multiple joints. You're, as a power lifter, generally doing those lifts pretty heavy, even in the volume phases, at least in terms of relative intensity. That's the closeness to the maximum amount of weight you can take for a certain rep range, for those that don't know. Just generally, you're going to be handling very high relative intensities throughout your training cycle. If you're constantly going to failure on those lifts, it's going to be impossible for you to recover. Just because we do so much repetitive motion in powerlifting, recovery is almost, I would say probably a little bit more important than in bodybuilding, just because the movements that you're doing are just so taxing. If you were constantly taking everything to failure, you just wouldn't be able to train to the fullest. And then, each subsequent session would get worse and worse, and you'd really never be able to peak because you'd just be overtraining at that point.
Any thoughts there, Kedric?
Yep. I think a big part, as Joe mentioned, is fatigue and recovery. That's a very important point. Something I would also like to mention is the fact that powerlifting there's some form of skill involved. It's not as complex as weightlifting, where you have to do a clean and jerk and snatch. But the more efficient you can execute the movement, the better it would be, especially when moving maximal loads. And especially for beginners and sometimes intermediate, where we're still trying to refine technique to develop the most efficient technique for that particular individual. The further away you can stay from failure, the better you can execute the lift technically, just because fatigue doesn't sort of like throw you off. So if you're constantly pushing yourself to a point of failure, you are sort of like ingraining a bad motor pattern, and that is one thing that could potentially be quite detrimental. So because you're not actually practicing something well, right? So for example, if you compete and you squat a certain way, when you train, you want to ideally practice in that same range of motion, the same bar path. But if you're constantly pushing towards an RPE 10 every single time, there will be some deviation in bar path, especially when the loads are heavier. Not to mention the fact that I wouldn't say heavier loads and failure causes injury, but there's potential. There is higher potential risk there, because generally, if you train towards failure, the overall training load would be higher as well. And couple that with poor movement patterns, and that could be an increased risk of injury. I'm not saying that it will cause someone to get hurt, because what causes injury or pain isn't really like black and white right now. But I said that could be just a safety issue. One, the ability to recover, as Joe has mentioned, and I just think it prevents someone from executing or learning a lift properly.
I think one more thing to add there as well, relating both to recovery and skill acquisition, is usually these days you're going to be doing the power lifts at least twice per week just to help work on the skill. And if you're extremely under recovered from taking things to failure constantly, you're probably not going to be physically ready to go into that session in the first place. So it's like I kind of mentioned, it's just going to steamroll into worse and worse training.
I think it's the kind of thing where I think when you first get into fitness, you sort of think, okay, failure sounds like a decent idea, but the more and more you look into it, it's like really, I think Brian Miner has a very, very good quote about it. I can't remember the quote, but it's like basically previous overload allows you for today's overload or something. Similar, probably butchered that quote, but it's a very, very interesting quote around the thing. But one thing I thought we should get into is exercise selection, and I think there's a lot of things that we can touch on here. So first of all, do you guys want to go over how would you set up specific days? For instance, since we're doing the main 3 lifts, which do we do first in a day? Do we have one day for each, or how does that generally work? Does it depend? Do you guys differ in your opinions on that? And then I think after that we'll go into when should we add in accessories, and then things like block pulls or shortened range of motion, etc., etc.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this is where Kedric and I are probably going to differ a little bit, just depending on our individual philosophies. So the way we're talking just essentially about setting up the microcycle here. Yes, the training week, the day. Generally for me, for most people, I'm going to set up their training days where they're going to be doing each of the lifts at least twice per week. The frequency may be higher than that. It may be lower than that, depending on their skill level, their experience, their ability to recover from certain lifts, that kind of a deal. But most of the time, they're going to be doing each of the lifts at least twice per week. The reason for that, as I mentioned before, is mainly about skill acquisition and practice. The more, it's just like I literally say this to every athlete that I'm explaining frequency to. It's like if LeBron James wants to get better at free throws, he's going to do more free throws. Now, that's not quite the same in powerlifting, because obviously we can't do squat, bench, and deadlift every single day. But generally, doing it more often and doing it within our ability to recover is going to make us better at the lift. Typically, most of my programs involve at least 2 out of the 3 power lifts on a single day, and I look to set them up so that you're doing all the different combinations at least once. So one day where you're squatting and benching, one day when you're squatting and deadlifting, and one day when you're benching and deadlifting. Sometimes depending on the frequency, I might even include an SBD day, so squat, bench, deadlift, all 3 in a single day. I've been doing that more lately during peaking blocks to get the athlete ready for competition, where they're going to be all 3 in the same day. Depending again upon skill level and how often they've been training, that kind of a deal, that might be split up over X number of days. It really doesn't. That honestly comes more down to their life schedule more so than anything, so that they can fit training together properly. The only time where I might swap the order around, so typically I'll line days up in the order of competition, because that's what they're going to have to do. Like I might, if they have squat and bench on the same day, typically they'll squat and then bench, because that's how competition works. The only time that I might swap that around is if they are having particular problems with that lift. So let's say a lot of people have problems with their benching. I might have a day where they're benching first, where that's the emphasis, where they're really working on that particular lift. But I do think, for the most part, doing them in order of competition is good, because it prepares you for what you're going to do in competition. As far as exercise selection, Well, we'll get into that in a bit. Kedric, you can go on your philosophy on setting up your training weeks.
Right. So I think before I go in, I think the Brian minor code is progressive overload. Now even I can't remember it. But I think he mentioned something like progressive. Your ability to add weight is a result from prior overload, not a requirement for subsequent overload. Something like that.
That is the quote. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the one.
Yeah,
that's
something
exactly
like that. Yeah.
Actually, one more thing that I should mention. Depending on the number of days that I have them doing, I might set that up in a pretty typical daily undulating periodization fashion, just because there's some good research on that from Dr. Zordos. So for those that don't know who that is, that's typically a week that's set up where you're doing a volume day first, a sort of power recovery day second, and then your strength day is at the end of the week. At least in Dr. Zordos's research, that shows superior gains over other models on at least the squat and the bench press significantly, and I think there was some practical significance on the deadlift as well. So that typically shapes my training week for the most part for people. Again, that can change depending on the individual.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Floor is yours, sir.
Yeah. Nah, it's good. It's good. I think the big part, like what Joe mentioned, is we usually set it up to fit or replicate the structure of competition as much as possible. So I won't dive too much into that. I'll talk about a little bit on like the variations that happen. So the number one thing is that Joe did mention the LeBron James example, where practicing a skill more frequently would allow sort of like better results, provided that athlete can recover from it. So the research actually shows that higher frequency training for the bench press specifically has some form of it's better for the bench press regardless of training volume. But there's also research showing that higher, if I'm not mistaken, this paper was published in like April 2019 by Damas and colleagues, and he showed that the variation between high frequency or low frequency training it varies from individual to individual. So that's something we always have to take into account, is that the individual variability that happens. So not I know that I have athletes that would like to do try not to squat too much, just because they'll go in and like, oh my gosh, squat again. So I'd rather have 2 squat sessions rather than 3. And it's just probably something mental. That's something that they prefer. And I think preference does matter, given within the respective guidelines, right? We can't say like, oh, you're going to have 3 sessions into one and then like destroy your legs like the old school bodybuilders do, and do every single leg exercise into one. So within certain framework and guidelines, preference does matter, especially research show that that's the individual variances. And in terms of exercise sequence, usually how I usually structure it would be mainly dependent on how many days I have with the athlete where he or she can train. So and how many days they would like to execute the competition lift, how many weeks out from competition, etc. But it's usually a squat, then a bench, and depending on the athlete, usually if they are not if they are quite new, I'll separate the deadlift day and have the deadlift like the day after the squatting and benching, because doing squat, bench, and deadlift in one single session is actually quite taxing. And the only thing I would change is sometimes I would have, let's say someone benches 3 times or 4 times a week, I would have maybe one session where they would bench first instead of squat, so that they can like, hey, one session be a bench focused day, right? And then the squat could be light-ish. So I feel like that sort of like motivates the athlete, especially if the athlete wants to get better at the bench press, to like sort of like dedicate their effort and focus towards that. Because typically the squat is you move heavy loads during the squat, and if you're doing high volume, you're just probably like gas. There'd probably be like central fatigue from the squat, and then going to the bench press, you might not be as motivated. And another thing would be like taking individual variance into account. People that when they wouldn't be able to bench press after they squat, if they squat low bar because their elbows hurt. So things like that. Those are some of the variances that we have. Like I say, everything's not I think Joe would agree as well that everything is not set in stone, but we have certain guidelines and principles in our head and we use those guidelines to sort of like or those models to determine what course of action we would take for that particular individual athlete. Because at the end of the day, Joe and I were both like online coaches, which the reason why people hire coaches is to have a customized program. So if everybody uses the same program, I really disagree with that. As you're kind of doing a disservice to your athletes and you're just being lazy, I guess. So taking that individual variance into account is very important, but also having that principles as a foundation and as a framework is important as well.
Yeah. I think in general we should preface one more time that all of these things are maybe our starting points for things, and then we would change them depending on the athlete. Like for example, I have a gal who just did IPF Bench Worlds. As you might imagine, she loves. So she's got a few days a week where she gets to bench first because that's her favorite lift and she just enjoys it that way. If you take anything away from this podcast, it should just be that the things that we're teaching you are more than anything just the basic starting points, and you should be able to customize your programs for your athletes to their needs or to your needs, depending on what you need specifically.
And then one thing that I think is something that I'm confused about in terms of powerlifting programming, in terms of if we take things, and I guess you could, hopefully I'm correct on this, you can put them in the same categories, things like block pulls, things like, I don't know what you call it, bench pressing with the blocks on your chest, basically reducing the range of motion. Yeah, that.
Board presses, yeah.
Yeah. So things like that, when are those implemented, and am I correct in assuming they are to increase the strength in a specific portion of a lift?
So, there are, for me, if I'm programming, so I'll start off with the ones that you named specifically. For me, if I'm giving an athlete something like a block pull on deadlift, it's usually not to quote unquote strengthen within a certain range of motion. If anything, like oftentimes you'll hear people talk about, like I need to strengthen my lockout in the deadlift or something like that, and that might be why they're doing block pulls. You usually with the deadlift specifically, it's a positional problem that's causing issues at lockout. Yep. So oftentimes you'll see that athletes will they'll tuck their pelvis under so that their glutes are artificially closer to the bar, and then they'll break the bar from the floor very easily, but then they'll end up missing at the knees, and that's because their glutes are already maximally contracted at that point, so they can't finish. So oftentimes you'll see people like, oh, we'll just do block pulls. Usually that doesn't really end up making things better in that sense, though. It's not to strengthen that range of motion. The reason that I would prescribe something like that would be to kind of learn what it feels like to pull from the proper position, where you're not tucking your glutes under. So that's kind of the reason that I would use that tool, and that's in general my philosophy on variation is not to strengthen in a certain range of motion, which I'll be honest, I don't really think that that's possible. I don't think that the transfer comes in strengthening the range of motion. I think it helps with refining technical issues more so than anything. Like a board press, like you can't really, and I guess we should talk about stick points in general there. Like a sticking point for a lot of people is the reason that they use board presses. They're like, oh, well, I stuck here. I'll use a board press that simulates that range of motion and I'll get stronger there. In general, what's actually happening there with a stick point is it's the point that you've lost the most momentum in the lift, and that's where a stick point manifests. But for most raw lifters, you start to lose momentum in the lift right at the bottom of it, no matter what the lift is. It just depends on your leverages and your personal technique where that stick point is going to actually manifest. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to say, well, if I bench, from this board, I'm going to be able to train in that range of motion and therefore make that range of motion stronger. That's not an actual thing. Where something like a board press might be useful is just learning the technical aspect of fighting through that stick point. or perhaps maybe like something like some supramaximal training where you're actually maximally overloading it. And I think that's where you'll see a lot of people apply that kind of a training these days. You're able to use more weight than you might normally would. So that's my general philosophy on any sort of variation, is that it will help improve your technique in a way that cueing won't. So it might punish you in a way if you do it incorrectly, and therefore it helps teach you the correct technique, or it might put you in a position where it's easier to understand what you're doing wrong on the main lift, and therefore it transfers over when you are doing the competition lift. Kedric?
Yep. So just to be clear, when we talk about like these exercise variations, we're talking about variations of the main lift and not accessory movements like a hamstring curl for your squat, right? So just to be clear, which is the reason why we're only talking about these variations. That the first thing is I completely agree with Joe. Usually, a lot of lifters, like when we have positioning issues, I usually like block pulls, right? That's the best example. I think I had this conversation with a ton of people. A lot of people like to use it for like overloading the deadlift, like loading like way more because the range of motion is less because the bar is higher off the floor. So people like to overload it, but I tend not to use it as overloading method, more of a, like say, a teaching tool, right? Get in the proper positioning, you feel this is how it should feel like. And for some individuals like myself, I actually find block pulling a little bit more difficult than pulling from the floor. Maybe, taking into consideration as well that I'm not well practiced with block pulls compared to pulling from the floor. But I actually find block pulls a little bit more, like say, punishing if I'm not in the right position. Whereas on the floor, I can potentially just make the lift, complete the lift, even there's some room, some error. So like what Joe said, it's a teaching tool, positioning tool, breaking down the lift. And to add on to like sticking point, I think a big part of sticking point is that people think that the sticking point or is where they fail, but the thing is that where you fail might not actually be where you are the weakest at. So think of it as an analogy from like if you're driving a car, right? I think I heard this from Eric Helms. So if you're driving a car and if you see like a hazard or like something in front of you, you will jam the brakes, right? And that's when you stall. But because the car still has momentum, the car actually stops in front, not the part, not exactly when you jam on the brakes, depending how good your anti-braking lock system is on your car or how old your car is, right? So the part where you fail might not be actually the point where you're the weakest at. So the understanding of which range of motion that you're actually the weakest, we are giving it a best guess. So, but going through the whole range of motion might actually be way, I would say, much more useful than just thinking of working through a sticking point. But I think a big part of variation would be one, like I mentioned, further away from the block, you can have more variations, and would be taking into account the training monotony. For example, coding, let's use like Taylor Edwards as an example. And I think he does very much, and I think Joe is the same as well. They don't do much variations because they probably don't like variations at all. Like I'm pretty sure that Taylor does like squat, bench, deadlift like almost exclusively. But for someone who might actually find that these exercises are way too boring, or like it's just too monotonous, having some variations actually can spice things up, sort of like have give them the effect of novelty, and that might potentially increase adherence as well. And things like using variations, use myself as an example. I have like some pain on my shoulder, so I'm only benching to a board because I can't go all the way down. I can't bring the bar to my chest if I want to move through a pain-free range of motion. So in a way, my range of motion is limited. So I'm using a variation that still allows me to train and get stimulus, but not potentially aggravate or sensitize myself to even more pain. So that would be another situation where variations can be useful. And I think another thought process that I had recently was while being specific is great, what we are trying to look for is some form of transfer, right? So I'll use my previous prep as I competed like 1st of June, which is like a month ago. I used that prep as an example when I was training for my squat. So I'm a powerlifter, so powerlifters shouldn't be sprinting, but I participated in university research, and I was sprinting at 100% maximal speed, and I popped my hamstring, and like I couldn't sit on the toilet bowl for like without pain for like 3 to 5 days, right? And that was pain. So what I did when I went back to training was I used self-limiting exercises. So when I first started squatting again, I did no knee sleeves, no belt, and tempo squats. Like the load is probably like limited by the variation you're using. So that's like a self-limiting variation. And then the next week, I just throw on some knee sleeves. And then the following week, I did knee sleeves and squat. So like how my typical squat would look like. So the load progression increases. So I think that helps me in a way where it sort of like prevents me from being too over-eager and jumping right back to heavy loading, which some of us, we have that tendency like, oh my gosh, I'm like, oh, I injured my leg, I injured my knee, and then I'm going back to heavy squatting like 2 weeks after that, right? We have that tendency, and we like to do that, but having some sort of self-limiting variation kind of allows like a more gradual progression and allows like the loading to happen more gradually, because there's some research saying that training load and sort of like injury has like some relationship there. And going into the competition, I knew that I didn't have much time to prep, so all I did was high bar squats for reps, high rep range, because being in the low bar position with higher rep range for like extended periods of time just messes up my elbow, and I just did pause squats, pause comp squats, and the only comp specific squat I did was working up to a top single before my comp pause squat. So while there's not a lot of specificity, but in that context, in that situation, those variations sort of like had a better transfer. I'm not saying that if I hit like a 10 kilo squat PB, but I'm not saying that it's the best solution. Perhaps I could have better gains on the squat if I could have practiced my comp specific movements more. But the fact is that within that situation, within that context, I felt like I made the best choice to have the greatest transfer over. So things like I use this example. We know that practicing the skill would develop better results for the specific skill, as Joe mentioned, the LeBron James example. But the fact is that if the athlete absolutely hates it, no matter how high of a specificity you have, there wouldn't be any transfer, because the athlete would be like, nope, I'm not gonna like this. Like this sucks. I mean, if like, am I gonna do this again? Like, if the athlete goes in every training session saying like this sucks, I absolutely dread this exercise, even though it has the highest specificity, I don't think the transfer would be as great as if you could include something that the athlete would actually like. Mm-hmm. So taking that into account, while the principle of specificity is really high, we need to think like what would transfer best. And to put it simply, is like specificity is a general, like it's a broad sweeping statement, but transference is sort of like more individual, taking into account individual variances. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to say, and yeah, this is something I had on my mind, especially considering my last prep and stuff I've been pondering on when I can't sleep, and after counting sheeps to 1,000 doesn't help. So yeah.
I think one more point that I might want to add on as well is, just as a takeaway for any individuals that are using this as a way to help themselves program, is ultimately variation is good, but it's not necessary entirely either. If you're the kind of person like Taylor or myself that finds variation not so much fun, or you might find, like me for example, I had a coach who had me doing nothing but tempo work constantly, and I hated it. I absolutely hated it, and I actually found that it made my lifts it made all of my lifts go down. The biggest thing is finding what helps you balance out your training with your personal wants and enjoying it, because enjoyment should still be a factor in your training program. And I also think that a point that Kedric sort of touched on but didn't directly address is variation can also be a useful tool for making sure that you don't get injured. So he mentioned that, for example, he does high bar squatting because if he low bar squats too much, it messes with his elbow. If you know that you're somebody that has a certain type of injury that gets aggravated by a certain lift, variation is your best friend when it comes to that. You may need to at some point do that specific lift, but if you can train through a full training cycle pain-free, and then at the very end, just address that competition variant just to make sure that you're a little bit practiced with it. That's going to be a lot better than if you tried to force practicing with the competition lift throughout the entire training cycle.
Yep, 100%. Completely agree.
Cool, fantastic. So, I don't want to go for too much longer because I don't want to hold you guys too long, but I think it might be an interesting point to sort of touch on. Last of all, in terms of rep ranges, is there a low and a high end that you guys will generally reach to? Probably a relatively short question, but when programming, is there a high end of rep ranges? I'm assuming the highest will be during a volume phase, and then low end of rep ranges probably during intensity phase, I assume.
Sure. So in general, I would say, and this is more personal than anything, the highest that I've ever programmed for somebody is sets of 12. And that most of the time is coming for my smaller female lifters, because small females typically can handle a lot of training volume and need it to progress. So that's just a more time efficient way for an athlete to get that in. We know from various studies, I think Schoenfeld's was one of the first, that generally if volume is equated, but you practice more in the lower rep ranges, that your strength will be slightly better. But the point being that if volume is equated, you're going to get similar progress. You don't necessarily have to train in super high rep ranges if you don't want to, but they're going to be a lot more time efficient for getting the training volume in that you need to progress. So yeah, typically for me, it's as high as 12. And then obviously I'm having my athletes do singles. That point might change depending on the athlete. There are some athletes that I have that actually, they do singles year round on certain lifts because they like it and because they typically see better transfer of training over when they're not. Their singles might suck a little bit more during their volume phases because they're doing a lot more rep-based work. And as you know, the skill of a single is very different from the skill of doing reps. So if you're doing more rep work, your skill with a single is probably going to be a little bit off. But generally, rep range for me, it's more about time efficiency when building the training than it is about this is the magic rep range for this.
Yep, and I think Joe covered it quite well. When it comes to hypertrophy, like the literature is out there saying that rep ranges doesn't really matter, but time does. Obviously, the longer you train, there could be potentially, from a vacuum, it doesn't matter. And these studies are conducted within like short time frame, 8 to 12 weeks at max, and that's considered a good study because it's hard to get adherence for anything longer. So the thing is that if you think about training 3 hours, right? So 3 hours versus 1.5 hours for the same results. You do that for 8 weeks. But what about, like, say, powerlifting is not just 8 weeks? What powerlifting is not just 3 months? It's not just 1 year. But if you're constantly spending more time than you need to get the same results, I think it can definitely take a toll on you. One, obviously you have less time to do other things. Two, mentally as well. I think spending a lot of time in the gym for extended periods of time can be quite taxing, which is why sometimes when we program deloads or stuff, I just say instead of training 5 times a week, we just train 4 times. So one day you can just go out, walk, chill, get some sun, walk your dog, right? Those type of things can actually sort of dissipate fatigue, psychological fatigue, which actually I recently I stated this quite a lot now that I say the psychological factor is underrated, and I'm not trying to be like a sports psychologist right now, but diving back in is that certain rep range for certain athlete would potentially be more psychologically taxing. And people like say, Joe mentioned it well, you have to find that sweet spot where you can get the training adaptation you want, but still have that enjoyment. And certain rep ranges do not, certain rep ranges elicit some sort of like unpleasant feeling. And like Joe mentioned, hey, my athlete likes singles. We can do singles year round within certain guidelines, right? Not maxing out every single week. And the enjoyment factor within that rep range actually is what I would say determines the rep range I would program, especially when it comes to hypertrophy. And when it comes to strength and like skill acquisition under heavy loads, the closer we are to competition, we would definitely practice more singles, doubles, or like triples, doubles, or singles at a heavier load as we approach competition, just to get a specific skill acquisition. But there's no hard and fast rule, because at the end of the day, the rep range is just like, who am I to say that 5, right? Like let's say I'm running a program for Joe, like 4 sets of 5 is better than 4 sets of 6, right? Like that we can't say that either is better, but what I could say is like, hey Joe, would you like to do 6 reps, or would you like to do 5 reps? And because Joe is a powerlifter and like anything above 5 reps is cardio, he say no, I want to do 5 reps, right? But that's actually not true, because Joe actually liked doing 10 reps, which is absolutely sadistic. Just a fun fact out there.
I was just about to say,
yeah,
joke's on you.
Yeah, Joe actually loves doing 10 rep stuff. So, but when the athlete sort of like doesn't like 6 reps, and he keeps seeing 6 reps in his program every single week, you're like, what the heck's my coach doing? Is he trying to like just torture me? And like that could have like some potential, that could have bigger implications compared to the minutia of that rep range. So I would say rep range is a hard and fast rule. Take into account what the athlete prefer, and obviously high intensities closer to a single would develop skill acquisition for competition, because that is what we're doing during competition.
Oh, cool. So
Kedric, just to actually one more thing, just to counter. Sorry to interrupt. Just to counter Kedric's point, I do think that there is a point in time where you do have to say to an athlete like, hey, we've been doing a ton of volume in this rep range for a really long time. Your sessions are going to get really long if we keep doing all these 5s. It might be time for 6s. So I do think that while it's important, I think there needs to be a time where you need to be able to say to an athlete, hey, you're going to be in the gym for 5 hours, unless you want to do a higher rep range. So enjoyment is important, but there's a time that you're going to have to be like, okay, we might want to do 3 sets of 10 instead of doing 6 sets of 5.
Yep. I completely agree. I think the role of the coach isn't just to like, I mean, like I mentioned that having an athlete enjoy something is important, but I say like a role of a coach is not to be a nanny or babysitter or pushover. We have to understand that, yes, but it's also not to be a drill sergeant or like an army commander, right? So you have to find line. We need to know like, hey, like this is what the athlete enjoys, but I know there's a time to push, and within practical and realistic constraints, we have to push the athlete as much as we have to accommodate what the athlete enjoys. So it's always that fine line, and I think that is what makes what defines a good coach, is the ability to sort of like decide when to use what, when to push, when to hold back, and how do you sell the idea to an athlete, right? Because like Joe said, right, you're gonna spend 5 hours in the gym if you keep doing like 4 to 5 reps. But if you tell the athlete, no, I want you to listen to me and just do as I do, do as I say, the athlete might not have such a high level of buy-in compared to what Joe mentioned. Hey, speak to them nicely, say that within time constraints, potentially this time that you spend in the gym could be used doing other stuff like recovering, or we could even do like other stuff like more like an extra set of bicep curls if that's what you like, right? So trying to sell the idea to the athlete is important, and I think that is what like sort of like separates a good coach from like just the ones that are not that good, right? So I completely agree with your point. Very good one. Thanks for calling me out.
Cool. This is how our bromance works. Right? We go back and forth on these ideas.
Just a sprinkle of beef, no big deal. So One thing I would like to finish off with, so I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this because, okay, so in terms of, we'll touch on resources that are not your own, and then we'll go where to find you guys and resources that are your own. Is there any specific places that are like golden online that you think would be a decent place to go and learn some of the basics? Whether that be your own organization, whether it be other organizations.
Sure. I'll go over my top ones. I'm a little old school. I enjoy books. So a lot of the basic concepts that came from my first exposure to learning to coach people came from books. So Super Training, which is an extremely long translated Russian text from Russian powerlifters. That is an excellent resource if you want to learn how to program. That's fantastic. Some of Mark Ripeto's books have a lot of really good basic concepts. I believe there's one called Basic Barbell Training. That one was really good. There's a book on periodization by Tudor Bompa that was fantastic. What else? Even though it's about a specific training style, there's a lot of stuff about recovery in the book Squat Every Day that I really, really enjoyed. And a lot of things that are written by Izzy from Powerlifting to Win. His website has a lot of excellent resources as well if you're looking to learn the basics. Beyond that, I think that I could give a shout out to Brian Miner, whom you mentioned before. His blog is excellent. 3D Muscle Journey. We all know Helms and Berto and that crew. Their podcasts, their website, just in general, their YouTube. Actually, that was, I mentioned this before we started recording. One of the reasons I got into coaching was because of 3D Muscle Journey. So if you want to learn a lot about that stuff, they're a great resource. There's a group of two guys, my friends, over at Stoke Athletics. Their blog is excellent as well. I'll say Kedric's camp over at the Strength Guys definitely puts out a lot of great content. And of course, I can't shy away from our own team at the Strength Athlete. We have a podcast, YouTube channel, also starting soon, plugging. I'll have my own personal YouTube channel, which you can find just by typing Joe Stanek into YouTube. I'll have some cool powerlifting concepts there as well.
Cool. And Kedric, what would be your favorite resources?
Right. So obviously, I'll start with I won't mention what Joe mentioned, but like I say, I cannot give a plug to like Eric Helms because I need to pass my PhD. So that definitely the muscle and strength pyramids, both the nutrition one and the training one. Those are really good, right? Really concise. Everything in it is practical. It's not too overcomplicated. Mass research review. If you have the extra money to spend, that's really a really good research review that covers everything on physique, sport, strength training, recovery, sports psychology, and all of those kind of stuff. Man, I just sound like giving like plugs all the time.
Do you have an assignment due to Eric, Kedric? Because it sounds like you're trying to butter him up right now.
Before he gets back from the comp.
Yeah. I'm not an affiliate anyway, but just I think those two are really good resources that I refer to time and time again. Greg Knuckles' site has amazing stuff, right? Greg Knuckles I actually met Greg when he came to Malaysia, and he actually lived with me for a couple of days while he was doing seminar, and like we literally just spent like nights talking about training stuff, and that was like way back in the day. So Greg just finished his master's, so he'll definitely have more time to put out better content. But things like if you're really looking on a guide on like squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting, definitely check out, like he wrote like I think 20,000 words on like the squat, maybe slightly less on the bench and deadlift. But Greg Knuckles, Stronger by Science, is a great site. Another one I would like, just for old time's sake, when Joe mentioned super training, I thought about like the RTS manual, because when we first started RP, you cannot I gotta give tribute to Mike Tischer, who sort of like started the whole RPE thing for powerlifters. So RTS manual is quite a dated text, but I still think that there's some gems in it. Anything for like attempt selection, game day, or like coaching, looking stuff by Matt Gary would be really good. Their podcast is called the SSPT podcast. You can find them on iTunes. And if we look a little bit into like periodization stuff, I think looking at research from John Kiley would be really, really good as well. So that's something I've enjoyed. More research stuff, anything out strength training from Mike Zordos would be great. And like I say, Joe from the Strength Athlete, I enjoy the Strength Athlete podcast as well. I think you guys should write sort of podcast a little bit more because I actually enjoy it. And if you like,
you can tell Hanny that.
Yeah, it's like their podcast is great, and I think like they have like 19 episodes only, which is you haven't, if I'm not mistaken. And if you want to like legit learn any topic, because this is, I mean, I really sound like I'm buttering up Eric Helms, but you just literally have to type Eric Helms into like iTunes and just
seriously, it's true.
Because he has been like, I think he's like the most podcasted like
seriously
fitness personality, and he talks about almost like everything.
Yeah.
So if you want to find something specific, just type Eric Helms and then just go through like the glossary. I think someone should just compile like a glossary of all the podcasts and link to all of it so people can like refer to it, because he gets podcasts so often. I'm pretty sure it covers quite a wide range of topics. And something just or for beginners, I really enjoy Jeff Nippett's YouTube channel. I think Jeff Nippett does a great job distilling science and and
I think Vitruvian Physique is also pretty good. He's a little bit less known, but he's very research based as well.
Yeah, as well as Omar, obviously, as well. Very, very good. Yeah. I feel like it's sort of like a hierarchy of like places you should start as like YouTube people like that, and then you go down to like more intense YouTube people like 3DMJ, etc., and then you go to like mass, and it's like the general.
Yeah, so like the mass and like John Kiley and like Mike Zordo stuff is probably more research based, maybe higher entry level. But if you really want to start, just go like, I think Jeff Nippett stuff on YouTube does a great job distilling like research into like practical stuff, and he has like fantastic video crew and edits, so really, really nice videos to watch, even just for the complete like videography purposes. So I think on top of my head, those are some of the stuff, and I've been recently reading like more textbook stuff just because I'm a little bit more into academia. So one book is like, I think it's like Recovery and Sports Performance. That's really great. Talks about recovery in every aspect. Talk about the mental side as well as the physiological side. So that's great. So that's all from me.
Completely agree with all those references. Greg's actually coming on tomorrow, on Friday, so that's gonna be dope. It's cool how like small but wide this community is. Like at first, like you can see it as being so like small and enclosed, but the more you get into it, the more you realize it actually is quite wide, and there's so many different aspects. Like for instance, I find bodybuilders and powerlifters interact somewhat, but not that much, even though we do like pretty similar stuff a lot of the time. But there's still not really a divide, but it's like we don't talk that much. But I think there's a lot to be learned from both, which is the cool part. But what I think we'll finish off with, where can we find you guys specifically? So now plug everything you do, plug all your resources, products, etc. So everything you guys do.
So you can find me most of the time on Instagram at Joe_TSA. Just post a lot of training footage there, ramping up my educational content over there as well. So you can check that out for a few things there. Like I mentioned before, going to be starting my own YouTube channel. That's going to be a lot of educational content as well. So if you guys want to learn more about training, going to be having a ton of content over there. You can also find some of my personal writings and articles over at the Strength Athletes blog. You can listen to the Strength Athlete podcast, which hopefully I will be able to convince Hanny to help us produce some more episodes of. we're doing a lot more work over on the Strength Athlete's Instagram as well. So that's just at the Strength Athlete. Bryce is having Q&As there every Friday, and I believe the rest of us coaches will be joining him periodically as well. We also have a TSA YouTube as well that you can find. It's just youtube.com/strengthathlete.
Yeah, I noticed there was a very cool vlog Bryce put up. It was last week, I think. Very, very cool. So very cool stuff from that team all over. So, Kedric, where can people find you? Everything.
Right. So, just like Joe, mainly active on Instagram, Kedric TSG. You can also reach out to me on like the Strength Guys Instagram, which is the Strength Guys. And I started writing again. So Joe is starting with YouTube. I started like reigniting my passion for writing, and I think but not on a blog. So I write on medium.com, but yeah, it's just a bunch of rambles. But my most recent post, which is actually I think published today, or I can't remember what time the auto publish I set the auto publish for, but it's talking about like social media and stuff. And if you want to, I used Medium last time when I was like really, really young, writing some sappy like love emo posts. So if you want to read some of my archives on like my sappy emo posts, it's on there as well. But hopefully I'll be able. I mean, I'm saying this out to tell people that I'm writing again. So hopefully like the internet community and the keyboard warriors will keep me accountable. So
that's what I'm saying with my YouTube channel.
Yeah, so yeah, and because if it's not on the internet, it's not real, right? So I have to say it out on the internet, and yeah, I think mainly active through Instagram, and hope trying to put out a little bit more content as well. Although now it's mainly like lifting videos, but I try to have some like my caption should be a little bit on mindset, right? I write a little bit on like my mindset because I'm prepping for nationals in New Zealand, and yeah, just feel free to drop me a message. People, particularly in areas relating to weight cutting strategies, because that's what people they've been messaging me about. So feel free to do that, and feel free to reach out. I answer almost all my questions, but in time. So yeah, that's all, I guess. And then
is coaching available on the websites for both of you guys?
Yeah. So
go ahead, Kedric.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean the easiest way would be to reach out to me on Instagram, because I think Joe does it the same way. But I usually like to schedule a call with those people that reach out, just because I think a very important part about coaching is the coach-athlete relationship. So yeah, having this video call, having a video call at the start sort of like sets the foundation for that. So feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. We most probably end up setting up a video call to discuss whatever you need. So like I say, the best place to contact me would be on Instagram. And if you reach out through like the Strength Guys website, just say, hey, just type my name. If they said if anybody referred you, if you want to work with me, just say Kedric1.
Yeah, and the easiest way to get a hold of me is definitely either via Instagram DM or an email. And my email is just joe@thestrengthathlete.com. And just like Kedric, I always place an important emphasis on that initial call where over the course of a half hour to an hour, we'll go over everything that you could possibly need as far as coaching. Also, if you are a San Diego local and would like to work with me in person, I will be starting personal powerlifting coaching at Convoy Strength. Very, very unlikely that somebody from San Diego is going to be listening to this and needs powerlifting coaching, but in the off chance, I'm available for that as well. And if you want to reach out via the Strength Athletes website, you can just say, hey, I'd like to work with Joe, and they'll get that set up.
Hey guys, thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you give us a review or you really enjoyed the episode. Let me know any feedback. I'm always open to any criticism, anything like that. Reach out to me on Instagram at James_Walsham, or if you'd like to follow my business account, follow at the Hypertrophy Hub. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you would like to help the show, there's a list of ways to do so in the show notes, but if you're wondering how, the best thing to do is just give us a review on iTunes or just let me know how the show can be improved. Thank you very much.